Racist officer attacks black man, only to find out he's the mayor in disguise. Outside a fancy shop, a prejudiced police officer confronts a black man, which causes the officer. After hitting the black man, he discovers he has just arrested and assaulted Mayor James. Trent waited outside the shop, under the gentle glimmer of a street lamp, changing his suit jacket. Had been closed for hours, and while he looked at his phone, growing agitated, its black windows reflected the empty street. Joshua's assistant was running late once more as the minutes passed, so he leaned against the glass, verifying the street for any indication of Joshua's car when his attention was diverted by the loud sound of approaching footsteps. A voice yelled. James looked rapidly up and saw a white police officer approaching him with his hand firmly resting on his belt. James sensed the keen suspicion in the officer's eyes as he measured him head to toe. James knew before what you were doing here, posture. The glance he faced with more accusatory than curious. James straightened naturally and slid his phone back into his pocket, just waiting for someone he mentioned halted a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he looked across the empty street. James calmly said, "Waiting outside a clothing store at this late hour. My ride is running late." "You sure you're not looking right?" The officer's focus sharpened his hand, inching near his flashlight. Loitering possibly for something else, James felt a flutter of irritation in his chest, but he kept his face composed. "I'm just standing here waiting for a ride. Nothing more." The officer's lips curved into, "I'm not loitering." Half smile, but it lacked warmth. "Standing about in a suit. What's the occasion? Attempting to make yourself look important?" James looked at him irritatively, but he kept his voice level. "I'm simply waiting, officer. Nothing else is happening here." The cop moved closer, his presence becoming more forceful. "Does not appear like. You sure you're not trying? You don't exactly blend in around here, standing by yourself this late at night." James felt his pulse quicken. He had been in circumstances such to this previously where explanations, "It doesn't matter," presumptions speak louder than reason. Accusations are not necessary. "I am not breaking into everything I told you. I'm waiting for a ride." The officer neglected to fix his eyes on James, daring him to say something more. James's jaw hardened. He wasn't about to give in so readily. "I don't need to show you my ID. I'm not doing anything illegal." The officer's darkening hand hovered close to his belt. "You." James drew a long breath. "You display it when I ask for ID? Or is there something you're hiding?" The frustration is increasingly difficult to control. "I have told you what I am doing. That should be plenty. There is no justification for this." The officer's posture changed, his voice dropped lower. "And I decided how far this goes, not you, and right now." James tightened his fists, trying to keep his hands still. "And you're giving me a lot of reasons to keep asking questions." "Okay. I'm not breaking any laws. I'm not a threat. I'm simply waiting." The police got closer. "There's no reason for this." Now just inches from James. "Funny how you keep repeating that, but I'm not convinced. In fact, I'm starting to." Though James's tolerance was running thin. "Suppose you do not belong here." "I have every right to be here." The officer grinned, the strain between them palpable in the air. "See about that. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you until." James could sense the weight of the circumstances. "I am happy." The two guys stood there locked in a silent struggle. He looked up the street, the police pushing down on him, suspicious of the implicit threats hovering above. Once more hoping to find Joshua's automobile, but the road stayed deserted for a few seconds. Several minutes as the cops stayed hovering, waiting for James to move. The silent street felt. James knew this was not over, suffocating, the illumination from the street lamp sending long shadows across the pavement. Not until the officer's hand rested firmly on his belt. His eyes never left James's face. "I will be observing," he murmured, his tone low, menacing. James, his eyes hardened as he grabbed the officer's gate. Not yet. There was nothing else to say, so two men stuck in an unspoken clash, neither eager to. James stood strong, his body tight, as the cool night wore on, then descended as the officer insisted on not changing. The minutes dragged on, and still showed no indication of Joshua. The two men's conflict was evident in the air, as though the night had been charged with. James said his voice was under control, but the fury was starting to seep in. "I just said, waiting for someone. The cop moved closer with his hand, never leaving the belt wear. His voice was icy and patronizing. His handcuffs and flashlight rested. "I don't care what you've said. Something about you simply does not sit well with me." James clenched his fists but kept them at his sides. "What does not? Sit right here in a suit, or consider the officer's absence of belief that I belong here. Watch your tone. I'm the one asking questions, not you." James's heart accelerated, but he forced. Eyes glowed with wrath. "If I were staying calm, you would be questioning me for no reason. You have been standing here for 10 minutes. Something incorrect." By now, the officer's expression would have twisted into a smile. "Well, I figured plenty out. Guys like you constantly believe you're too smart to be caught, but I see nothing for what it is." James couldn't hold back any more, lingering, looking for a way into a place like this. "What do you think this is?" "I am waiting for my assistant. You have been standing here annoying me, and now you're looking for any way to make it worse." And the officer's smirk disappeared to be replaced with a stern gaze, stressing. James stepped forward, his voice. "I'm doing my job protecting people like you from causing disturbance in locations like this. Cold individuals like me." "What precisely do you mean?" "You know damned well what I mean." The officer snapped his voice. "Rising, you seem innocent and serene here, but I have seen this before. A suit doesn't change who you are." James's heart thumping in his chest, his rage boiling over. You know nothing about who I..." "James, am I know enough?" The officer shot back. "You're just another punk thinking he can talk his way out of trouble." I inhaled deeply, attempting to regain control. "You are the one causing disturbance. I have not done anything illegal." His eyes narrows. "You're real close to stepping where." The officer's hand slid for his cuffs. Over the telephone, James questioned, his voice steady but stern. "The line where I stop allowing you bully me for standing on a public sidewalk." The officer's grip tightened on the cuffs. "You seem wise, yet you think you..." James's blood burned, but he held his ground. "Can mouth off to me. I have authority here. Does not grant you the authority to harass people for no cause." The officer went forward, now inches from James's face. "If I feel threatened, I have no need for a justification right now." James could feel differently depending on how you're treating him. The officer's aggressiveness growing with every syllable, the situation SP spiraling out of hand, but he wasn't. "Not this time," James asked, startled. "I'm standing here unarmed and going to back down. Not how this goes. Waiting for a ride, and you're the one threatening to jail me." The officer's jaw nodded. James straightened his shoulders, his palm hanging over the cuffs. "I'll decide how this works. You're done. I'm not done until you stop treating me like a criminal." I'm staring directly at the officer's eyes blazed. James's heart hammered as he grasped for the cuffs, with fury and without further word. "You're under arrest." This was it. Watch the officer's hand slide toward him, the cuffs shining under the street lamp. And there was nothing he could do to stop James's heart from racing as the cop reached for the cuffs. The cold steel glinting in the low light. The weight of the occasion struck him all at once. He could not let this happen, not like this. Naturally, he retreated, his hands raised. "You cannot do this," he muttered, his voice sharpening, the mix of fear and wrath. "I have done nothing wrong." The officer's eyes flashed, his hold tightly on James's arm. "You just crossed the line. Don't resist." James wrenched his arm away, his heartbeat thumping in his ears. "I'm not resisting, but you're not detaining me for no cause." Officer's face twisted with annoyance. His hand shot out once more, this time using greater force to catch James by the... James fought to pull free. "You think you're above the law? Think twice." Wrist pushing him forward with a violent tug. His motions were rapid but under control. The officer's patience shattered. You wanted to fight, fine." His voice dripped with venom. He threw James hard against the boutique window, rattling the glass from the collision. James's I said, "Get off." Shoulders smacked on the icy surface. Jolt of pain pouring through his body. Tried to. With the burst of excitement, the cop pushed in close to force James harder against. Twist free, his muscles tightened. "I advised you to quit fighting." The officer, his breath scorching his neck. James strained to shove the cop away. His breath came in brief bursts as his mind raced through how had this accelerated so rapidly. The officer's fingers tightened their hold. You are the one pushing this too far. I'm done toying with you without warning, and I dug into James's arm. The officer swung his fist. The punch fell firmly on James's jaw, a powerful, terrible blow that sent his head wrenched to the side, erupting anguish over his face as he staggered against the window. Momentarily, the world spun around him. His eyesight blurred. James gasped, his hand automatically toward his face, the stinging sting of the blow still pulsating through his skull. He battled to calm his head, which was whirling from the shock you just experienced. The officer mumbled his words. Icy and merciless, he seized James once more, now slamming him face first into the glass with tremendous force. James gasped as his chest squeezed hard against the window. Harsh. You will learn your lesson. You cannot accomplish this, with the officer's hand crushing his arms behind him. Panted, fighting to find his voice through the fog of suffering, I watched the cop hissed as he racked James's. James's body sank as the metal bit his skin. Arms behind his back, the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. His cheek delicately pushed against the frigid glass, his mind whirling between suffering and incredulity, trying to turn his head. But the officer's weight kept him pinned, his breath weak and labored on the ground. The officer ordered pulling. James was barely able to recover himself before he turned back from the glass and pushed toward the pavement. His knees touched the ground. He was panting now. His face throbbed where the officer's fist had hit him. Ideas whirled frantically, the adrenaline still running through his veins. How had it come to this? He's done nothing wrong. And now the cop stood over him, shackled on the ground, attacked by the very people supposed to be defending him. His chest rising and falling with his own pent-up anger. Perhaps next time you'll consider twice before objecting to an arrest. James stared up at him, his eyes still whirling, yet his voice came out strong but tinged with agony. You will regret this. The officer sneered over him with the cuffs now fastened, not as much as you will as. James knew this was far from done. The night air crushed down on them. James felt the beginning of. As the officer roughly pulled him toward the patrol car, his jaw still, tight grasp of the handcuffs bit into his wrists. Pulsed from the hit, his body stiffened from the confrontation, but behind the agony and stress, a calmness started to flow, settle over him. He knew something the officer missed, and that knowledge gave him the advantage the officer still lacked. Bursting with self-satisfaction, turned toward the car, opening the rear door with a strong tug. Get it, and he instructed, his voice icy and strong. I advised you not to object, James. Instead, he straightened himself, inhaled deeply, and silently, almost smugly smiled. Before you toss me in the car, why not check my ID? The cop stopped, his hand still on the door, his brow wrinkling in perplexity. James's smile expanded ever so gently. You heard me, check my ID. It's in my wallet. Officer stopped, narrowing his eyes, as if trying to judge whether this was some kind of prank. You have plenty of. Now you want to help, James. Time to give me your ID. His gaze met his voice, cool and tinged with subdued confidence. Check you. You will want to know who you have just cuffed before this gets worse for you. The officer's confidence dropped, but he still wasn't quite believing it. Let's see what you have, he murmured, reaching into my pocket and flicking his wrist to extract his wallet, opening it and pulled out the ID card. Squinting at it momentarily, his expression was inscrutable, but as he worked through the data, the color washed from his cheeks. The title, everything fit into place. His eyes flew from the ID back to James's, incredulity and panic flashing across his face. You are right, James, remarked, his voice calm and slow. I am the mayor of this city. The officer's face became pale, the whole weight of what he had just done sinking, and turned back to the ID, as if expecting it would alter, but the awareness hid instead. He worked hard. His hands shook as he apprehended the highest-ranked official in the city. He stumbled with the cuffs, his former aggressiveness gone, replaced by panic. Sir, I didn't realize. James cut off, his voice still calm, but suddenly sharper, more forceful. You didn't realize. Know that you thought your prejudice blinded you, and now you find yourself in a situation you cannot negotiate out of. The officer hurriedly unlocked the cuffs, releasing James's face flushed with shame and terror. Wrists, I'm sorry, sir. James's voice rose gently as he caressed his painful wrists. Not meant. His eyes flashing with controlled wrath. You did not intend to strike me against that window. Treat me as a criminal, the officer stammered over his words, looking for some way to save the situation. Sir. That's the issue, you didn't see me. James snapped, cutting him off once more. Stood here and determined I was a threat since I didn't meet your definition of who should live in this area. That's what you did. The officer stammered, backing forward slightly, James's voice strong and unfortunate. Do you know what kind of predicament you have put yourself in? Do you know the repercussions of your acts tonight? The officer's eyes widened with terror now. Sir, I'm sorry, James's voice was icy. His remarks did not reflect what you intended for it to proceed. Cutting through the officer's flimsy defense, this is exactly what happens when you let your prejudices control your actions. You're supposed to serve and protect, not assault and profile. The officer swallowed hard, his face pale, his hands still shaking. I made a mistake. James's voice was low, controlled but fatal. Serious, you believe that will solve this? You believe an apology will suffice to offset what you just did? The officer couldn't meet James's eyes, his whole attitude falling beneath the weight of his. James stepped back, inhaling long breaths. I wanted your badge number. Now the cop fumbled too. James took out his phone, scribbling it down carefully, his voice barely a whisper as he repeated it one more time. Before staring the officer in the eye, James remarked, his tone final, and the next time you wouldn't be getting off so readily. He turned and left the officer standing there, paralyzed with fear and regret. James's mind was already racing ahead along empty street. Incident was not only personal, it was a sign of a far more general issue for which he was in a position to at last address. James strode briskly down the street, heading either one way or another after tonight. The weight of the evening's events settles mostly on his shoulders. His jaw still hurts from the officer's strike, and the mild burn of the handcuffs stayed on his wrists, but more than the physical suffering it caused was the wrath boiling under. He turned the corner away from the scene he dragged out, but the surface that drove his movements could not let this slide. His fingers quivering slightly from the adrenaline still running through him, he dialed from fear rather than from panic. Rapidly, the familiar phone ringing in his ear. Following a few rings, responded Joshua. James replied, short and direct. I need you to see me at City Hall now. Joshua's voice came through, perplexed but worried about happened. I'll explain when you get there, James interrupted. Just get there as soon as. James cut off the conversation and dropped his phone back into his pocket without waiting for a reply. His mind flew as he headed into City Hall. The city's lights created long shadows on the peaceful streets. Though more than that, the picture of his own reflection in the glass pane flashed in his consciousness. Officer's arrogant face. Trapped, wounded, humiliated, stuck with him. This was not only about him now, but also about what this symbolized. The unbridled authority, the obvious profiling of contempt for fundamental respect it embodied. All too familiar, and as mayor, he could act to address it. By the time Joshua at City Hall, Joshua was. James sighed and already waited outside, his face drawn with anxiety. What happened? You sounded off on the phone? Moment to calm his mind before responding. I was harassed and attacked tonight by one of our own cops. I was. Joshua's eyes sprang wide in disbelief. What, are you serious? James nodded grimly. Dead serious. He didn't knew who I was just as I was walking in a wealthy area of town at night. Joshua shook his. I don't even know what to say. Head, incredulity written on his face. That is what we are going to do. Act, James replied firmly. I'm done letting this kind of thing slip. Change has been discussed for too long now, and I have the evidence that this isn't only some theoretical issue. Joshua glanced at him with serious eyes. So James's mind was already running over the specifics first. We are formally complaining. We are addressing this with the police chief. Against the officer. Officer, I have his badge number. This has to be managed at the highest level. I'm going to ensure this officer deals with consequences of his activities and beyond. Joshua inquired, what about the more general matter? James's jaw tightened as he recalled the officer's scornful countenance. His treatment of him with casual brutality will serve as the catalyst. I have been advocating for change in the agency for months, but now I have the leverage required. We will publicize if necessary for the community. Needs to know that this kind of behavior won't be accepted anymore. Joshua nodded, his expression serious. I'm with you. Whatever you need, James advised. This won't be simple. The department will object, and the officer would try to twist this any way he can. But we are not backing down. Joshua looked at him for a second, then asked. Though physically James felt his jaw cringing slightly at the residua. Agony. Silently, are you okay? I'll be good. It's not the first time I've suffered, but this is more than that. We have to make sure this never occurs to anyone. Joshua nodded, his face grim. All right. Let's head inside City Hall. James sensed the weight of the evening's events settle into direction. Here was his chance to act, to correct the injustice he had witnessed. Stared into the gasoline for the transformation the city sorely required. The officer's haughty demeanor and negligent acts were a reminder of the systematic issues he had been working for years, but now it was personal, and he wasn't going to fight for years. Let it go. Next day, James entered the police precinct. His jaw still hurt. Things were going to change. From the onslaught last night, the morning rays poured long shadows across the windows. Joshua followed closely behind, his face set with a focused expression, moving with intent. Tile floor. Towards the front desk, when an officer looked up from his paperwork, right away, identifying James. I'm here. To see Chief Harlan, James assert, clearly his voice controlled, but the officer hesitated, casting a worried look at James's battered face. Yes, sir. I will let him know you are here. He grabbed up the phone, rapidly reporting. From his office at the rear of the station, the message in minutes Police Chief Harlan sent seemed tall. Early 50s, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude, his eyes fast turned to James's wounded jaw, and his attitude become more austere. Mr. Trent, Harlan observed. James disregarded a hand that I extended, coming to my office. We should talk about what transpired. Without waiting for a response, Harlan turned and led them down a long corridor, his stride strong with authority. They reached his office, and as the door closed behind them, the atmosphere got uncomfortable. Harlan waved toward the chairs in front of his desk, but James stayed still. Chief Harlan reported. His voice was neutral, but there was an incident last night. James repeated, his voice with a sense of defensiveness. I was harassed. Was attacked by one of your cops. I almost got jailed for being on a sidewalk, and you're calling it an event. Before Harlan could reply, the door opened, and Officer Greg Randall entered, his face pale and tight. He uneasily peered at James, then fast turned away. Officer Randall's motioning to a chair. We need to clear. Randall sat down, his body rigid. His swagger from the previous night vanished, replaced by nervousness as he looked to Harlan, then back at James, unable to make eye contact. The weight of his deeds started to seep in. James stepped forward, eyes fixed on Randall. Tell me exactly what you were thinking last night, when you chose to overlook what I said and escalate a matter not requiring anything more than a. Randall moved uneasily in his chair. I didn't know who you were. You thought James? Stopped, his voice cold. You assumed you had the right to treat me like a criminal since I didn't fit your concept of who should be standing in that area at night. You didn't care about the facts. Chief Harlan's voice sharpened as he turned to Randall. Officer Randall, you know that this is inappropriate behavior. Why did you not defuse the matter? Randall's gaze danced between Harlan and James. The first made a mistake, he said, just above a whisper. I thought you didn't care to find out, thus I didn't know you didn't know. James's voice rose. Let your prejudice control your behavior. When I called you out on it, you answered violently. Randall swallowed. I'm sorry. His pale face won't be fixed by whispering. James added, you have to understand what you did. You broke your oath. You are not only attacking me, meant to defend and serve this town, not terrorize it. Harlan nodded, his tone more serious. Now, Officer Randall, you crossed a line, and I have already put you on suspension awaiting an internal. Randall opened his lips to answer, but Harlan's icy stare stopped him. He turned back to James, his face pale and regretful, but it didn't matter. James turned to Harlan. His voice was quiet but firm. This goes beyond the behavior of one cop to reflect a culture in your agency that lets officials like. Randall believed he could get away with this. He considered me as a threat, and that's a systematic violation. Issue one that has to be taken care of right now. Harlan's face hardened, but he nodded slowly. I know your annoyance, mister. Trent and I are dedicated to handling this matter. James crossed his arms and showed relentless addressing of it. This calls for more than simply an internal inquiry. Public knowledge of this department's operations is much needed. Is actually working to change. I want a complete report made public openness. Chief Harlan's expression stiffened somewhat, but he maintained a measured tone. We will make sure the... James moved closer to Harlan's desk. His inquiry is exhaustive and suitable action will be done. Voice lowering, but with intent. This is more than one event, Chief. This is about the direction of this department. If actual reforms fail, I will make sure the public is aware of the situation. This city deserves better. Heron stared James for a long time, then nodded. Clearly, James turned to Randall one last time. His voice is softer but no less strong. You could get away with this supposing you had all the power, but now you know you don't. Your actions will have repercussions. Randall's non-response, unable to even meet James's stare. Without another word, James turned and left the office, Joshua closely after. Though James understood this was only beginning the struggle for justice and reform, air outside felt lighter. This time, he wouldn't stop until the precinct James knew had undergone changes. He understood that impetus was at last on his side. Now it was time to ensure the system underwent good changes. James left the precinct with a clear head, his movements consistent as he and Joshua headed to the car. The cold. He inhaled deeply, contemplating the immensity of what had just happened. Morning air filling his lungs had started the wheels of responsibility, but this was merely the beginning of actual reform. More than one meeting with Joshua. The police chief broke the stillness as they arrived at the automobile. Do you suppose they will follow through? They will have to, James said, getting into the driver's seat. This is not something they can sweep under the rug. Not this time, Joshua agreed, but still looked worried. What if they choose Randall the scapegoat to suspend, maybe even fire him? Nothing else changes James's grasp on the steering wheel. That won't. James's thoughts ran the weight of his driving through the city. We are not offering them that option. Obligations pressed down on him, but they also motivated him. This was not only about last night, but about the damaged. Joshua looked at him. His reform program couldn't wait anymore. He had put him in that state. Anxiety still wriggles his brow. We must get ahead of this. Once people learn what happened, the narrative will blow out. James nodded. We must be in charge of the story. On our terms, the people need to hear the truth. By the time they arrived at City Hall, James had already personally confirmed it, developed a strategy, and hurried to his office, his mind focused on what had to happen next to acquire the press. Ready, James remarked as he sat at his desk staring at the clock. I want to do a news conference this afternoon. No delays. We will describe together the actions done and make it very evident that there will be openness in this. Joshua nodded instantly, dialing his phone. Are you going to tell them everything? James stopped, considering the specifics. Sure, they should be aware of the whole truth. We cannot ignore this. Joshua stopped, his phone in hand. You will name the officer not yet, James mentioned. The inquiry still has to take place, but I will make it evident what he done and how bad it was. Within hours, the media gathered outside City Hall. Reporters, news cameras, and people crowded the area before the structure, waiting for James to address them. Could sense the... Joshua entered his workplace, phone in hand, tension growing, the city already humming with conjecture. We all set the press. Are you sure you want to arrange everything? James changed his tie in the mirror, his jaw. Joshua agreed. Leighton do this as James, still bruised. The only way to ensure they grasp the seriousness of this. Left City Hall, walked to the podium. The audience calmed down. Cameras flashed, microphones were held high, and everyone turned to see him. He inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the moment. Good afternoon, James started his speech. Calm but determined. I called this news conference today to discuss an incident last night involving one. Rising as people drew in to hear more last night of our city's police officials and myself, the audience heightened the suspense. Although I was calmly waiting for a ride outside a store, an officer on patrol approached me. The officer grew more hostile and started assuming things about me and why I was there. James stopped, letting the weight of his words sink in before carrying on, accusing me of lying simply because I didn't fit his concept of who should be in that community when I gently sought to Just explain me the circumstances. He attacked me handcuffed and was about to toss me back of his patrol car. A murmur rippled through the assembly, the shock of his words sinking in. I resisted James's persistent voice, rising with determination. At no moment. I remained calm, lucid, and polite, but what counted to him was what he saw when he looked at me, not the words coming out of my words did not explain him. He sensed a threat and responded under that presumption. James turned back to the throng, his voice firm, but looked at Joshua, who nodded encouragingly. Passionate, it wasn't until I told him to verify my ID that he understood who I was. At that particular instant, everything changed. He uncuffed me, stammering apologies. Then the panic set in, knowing the error he had made. But it wasn't only about me. This is about the structural problems with our police department. He moved forward slightly, clutching the podium sides. This is not only about one cop. This is about a society that lets these presumptions be formed, is one in which people can be handled like suspects, based more on their appearance than on their behavior. This is what we have been working to change. The audience was quiet, hanging on his every word. There will be a thorough look at the behavior of this cop, James continued, and I will personally make sure the inquiry is open. The people of this city deserve to what transpires in their police department, and I won't let this be another narrative. James stopped once more, fades into the backdrop, locking gaze with the cameras. But this goes beyond one occurrence. This is about implementing actual long-lasting changes in our. For years, I have been advocating police reform. Yesterday night, I saw personally why that struggle is necessary. None should be treated the way I was treated last night. Reporters started yelling questions there. There will be more to say as James put up his hand, quiet the voices rising in the audience. Research continues, but let me make one obvious point. Genuine change starts here rather than ends. Will not cease until every person living in this city, regardless of their background, can rely on that they will be treated respectfully and equitably by the very persons pledged to guard them. James moved out from the stage. Joshua met him at the bottom of the steps, his look somber. That was strong, Joshua murmured silently. James nodded. It's time for this city to rise. You did what was necessary. Long enough already. We have discussed reform. Now it is time to bring it about. As they returned to City Hall, James saw the weight of leadership more than ever, yet he also felt something other, a renewed sense of purpose. It was up to him to advocate the reforms. He had been waiting for this now. The city sorely needed this time. He wouldn't stop until the system underwent good. James sat in his office at City Hall, gazed out the big windows over the city, the news conference having rocked the cities. Since he left the podium, the phone had been ringing non-stop from council members, leadership, and local businesses, and even from his constituents, inundated, everyone eager to learn more, to voice their indignation, or the city was waking up to support or demand speedier action. Nonetheless, Joshua entered the enormous task ahead. Office's phone in hand. You have been attracting a lot of attention from social media. The press is covering the story non-stop. James groaned and massaged his temples. We must maintain the pressure on. I want everyone to understand. Joshua nodded, indicating how serious this is. Approaching the desk, I mentioned some community leaders have informed me they're willing to help you, but they also have specific concrete questions about what improvements you'll be advocating. James nodded gently, his mind already racing. We should begin with looking at Officer Randall, but that is only the beginning. More thorough control, better training, and tougher responsibility need for actual systematic improvements. Though I believe that Joshua's demeanor was serious, you know the police union will fight this tooth and nail, and are already rebuffing your public remarks, claiming you're rushing the gun. James's union has no opinion on this, answered, his voice strong. If they are not ready to change from inside, else we will push from the outside. This is not going. Before Joshua could reply, James's assistant knocked on the door, and Mr. Trent, the police officer, entered. Chief is here to meet you. James nodded. Send him in. Chief Harland, after a brief glance with Joshua, now more measured, he gave a tight-lipped nod to both men before seated across from one another. Usually confident, James's, there was a brief, awkward hush as Harland's eyes locked with James. Mr. Trent Heron started. His tone is courteous, but with a hint of defensiveness. I have seen the coverage of the press conference. I can see why. You felt compelled to go public, but James leaned forward, his hands to talk about our future. Held in front of him. What is there to discuss? The officer's actions? Unjustified. The inquiry must find. Move fast. Harold moved in his seat, and there must be repercussions. I think that Officer Randall's actions merit a careful review. We have already suspended him, awaiting the result, but you know that these things take time. We cannot jump to judgment just on James's stern expression.
Chief.
The public deserves responsibility, so it is important to let them know that this is being managed honestly, and that implies no delays. Harlan scowled slightly. I have worked in this department for more than 30 years and understand the delicate confidence of the community right now, but we also have to make sure we follow the correct protocols. James inhaled, his voice cool yet. This is about repairing confidence that has already been damaged, not only about processes. Officer Randall's behavior fits a more general issue. You know, I have years of complaints coming over my desk. Allegations of racial profiling, needless force. Most of them go ignored. I am aware of the jaw-clenching and land problems. Nevertheless, big adjustments cannot occur overnight. I am not requesting overnight changes, James mentioned. Rising little, but we cannot sit on our hands as this department loses the faith of the very people it is meant to defend. Harlan met James's eye. The time for little incremental repairs is running out. We now need thorough reform right now. After a lengthy silence, his countenance was inscrutable. James nodded slowly, then back off his mind. First, we must swiftly arrange his ideas. Then, we must create an autonomous monitoring committee, someone outside. Second, I demand mandatory evaluation of misbehavior accusations in the department to provide suggestions for discipline. Every officer in the force should receive de-escalation training with particular instruction on racial bias. And third, there has to be a public reporting system in which Heron raised an eyebrow and people may view the development of complaints and investigations. James nodded. Let them push, but you know the union would object fiercely on it. People must understand that this is non-negotiable and that the department is not safeguarding its own at the cost of the community. We cannot let internal investigations be paid for silently behind closed doors. Harold sighed, stroking the back of his neck. You're asking for a lot. I'm asking for what's required, James answered forcefully. This is about guaranteeing that what happened to me, not only about correcting what happened to me, but also about doesn't happen to anyone else. Harlan gazed down for a second, precisely assessing his alternatives, when he eventually talked in a quieter voice. I can see your point of view and agree that modifications are required. I will forward this to the department, but you should be ready for a battle not only from the union but from officials who feel that they're. James leaned forward once more, his gaze fixed on Harlan. This is not about persecuting anyone here. Regarding improving the police force, if any officer feels intimidated by responsibility, then perhaps they shouldn't be on the force in first place. Harlan's lips narrowed, but he nodded. I'll bring your ideas to the department. Leadership. Harlan stood to go. James stayed sitting, attentively remembering what we could achieve. Quietly, Chief, James whispered, the eyes of the city are now on us. Do not let this chance for transformation to pass. Harlan stopped at the door and turned back to James. I won't, he said, his tone more honest than before. Whether or not we like it. Heron exited the room, and silence descended, and Joshua exhaled sharply. You could tell he would really follow through. James's jaw still raw from the. Joshua nodded gently. Night before, he will have to go too far to let this break apart now. What's? James got up and walked over to the window, gazing out over the city. We keep pushing. We gather the community, we remain visible, and we keep the pressure on until actual reforms are in place. This is not only about one poor quality. Officer Joshua folded his arms and showed a faint smile. I believe you are ready to change a system. James grinned grimly. I have been ready for a long time. As the sun started to drop over the city, James knew the battle was only starting, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like victory, actual lasting change, was at last within reach. The next day, James spent no time pushing his agenda. The press conference had spurred a flood of discussions on the streets and offices, and on every news outlet the city uses. James knew it wouldn't be long until the opposition developed as police department pressure grew more severe. From the union and department leadership, he stood in the mayor's office staring down at a stack, fully charged. Joshua entered the room, his look furious, but determined. He had documentation outlining his reform ideas. "I just got off the phone with a few council members. Public support your measures, but there is opposition from the..." James nodded. Usual suspects. I expected someone from Joshua's side to be pushing most strongly. Some of the council members closely associated with the police union are exercising caution because concern for the political blowback. "We don't have time for cautious," James said unequivocally. "This is about genuine rather than political issues. Change, right, but they are politicians. They will safeguard their own interests first." James looked at his watch. "We must present these ideas before the council today. If we wait any more..." Joshua pulled out his. The police chief recently published a statement supporting the inquiry, but said that the police department must let changes undermine the ability of officials to perform their duties. James's jaw tightened. "That's code for..." Joshua nodded. "Exactly, but the community's rallying calls from advocacy have come from exactly here. Groups and local leaders all morning people demand action, so we give them action." James answered. "Set up a meeting. We will work this out with the council and police union leadership in hours." James was standing in a packed City Hall's conference room had a thick tension on one side. Numerous city council members sat there with, from apprehensive to sympathetic, expressions ranged from them sat police union officials. Along with Chief Haird, the police union president was a stocky man with a stern face, seated glaringly, with his arms crossed at. James from across the room started the discussion with politeness, but he soon cut right to the point. "We are not here speaking on the necessity of transformation," he said. His voice is consistent, "and the people of the city have spoken, and they want. We have an obligation to repair the flawed system as it is." The union president shut in. "Although we have always worked closely with the city, some of these changes you are suggesting will tie the..." James leaned forward. "This is not about tying anyone's hands. This is about hands of our officials allowing it. Making sure authorities live up to the expectations we have of those charged with public protection. If responsibility hurts your force. So, the issue with the force is not the reforms." Chief Harland cleared his throat. "We advocate better instruction, particularly with regard to de-escalation strategies, but the oversight committees will produce significant conflict. Officials will feel as though they are always under scrutiny." James shot him a harsh look. "We're talking about people who don't know the risks they run. You should not rely on your department to fairly investigate misbehavior. The public need a system they can believe in, and..." Right now, one of the councilwomen Green leaned awkwardly in her seat. The others shifted uneasily forward. "I agree with the mayor. If the people cannot rely on the police to keep their own responsible, we will never rebuild faith in law enforcement." The union president's face reneged. "You're not out there on the streets. Our officers are risking their lives every day. You sit behind desks and believe you know what it's like." James's voice was cool. "What I know is that this city cannot afford another event like the one I experienced, or worse, every day we postpone these changes we are." The room fell quiet for a minute. Then Chief Harland spoke once more deliberately. "Risking lives. Time, what precisely are you suggesting?" James detailed the reform quickly, not wanting to allow any opportunity for delay. "The mandatory racial bias and de-escalation training, public complaint reporting, independent oversight committee, and more responsibility for officials who use racial profiling or unwarranted force. This isn't only," James remarked, "about making the department look better. This is about improving." The union president stood up, clearly enraged. "You will undermine morale among our officers already feeling as though they are under siege." James didn't flinch. "Morale is not the problem when people are being unfairly targeted, or worse, the system will. When the officials who really want to serve and protect can accomplish this in a department where everyone responsible." The strain in the room deepened as the union representatives talked among themselves following a protracted. One of the council members stood out. "We should consider this for a vote. We have heard enough." An hour later, the council, although James recognized it was merely the result of agreed upon forward with his reform plan, it was a victory. Beginning as he exited the conference room, Joshua caught up with him rather well. "That wasn't simple, but we got what we needed," James stated for now. "But we need get ready for their next action since the union is not going to accept this lying down." Joshua nodded. Then James looked at his phone, already planning ahead. "Next we concentrate on the research. We keep working harder than ever." The wheels of reform were running, but James knew. Days had gone by since the municipal council decided to pursue James's reform. The actual struggle was just starting. But the police union was acting as best it could to slow down the research on Officer Randall, and Chief Harland had grown progressively unresponsive. Every stride forward seemed to offer. James could see the strain rising from the community. He knew the public from which fresh delays would arise. Neither would he. Sitting in his office, James checked the most recent information on the probe, or more precisely, the lack of updates. Nothing was progressing. The internal review of the department, under bureaucratic justifications, Randall's name remained unpublic. Joshua entered the room, searching, annoyed. Mike's research should have gotten underway by now, but Harlan's people are dragging their feet. James tightened his jaw, his fingers tapping the desk, tying it up with red tape. "They are trying out the clock." Knew they would stall, but this is worse than I had anticipated. Joshua nodded. "You're right, I have received calls from local officials and reporters all day seeking updates. People are wondering why the officer's identity hasn't been published." James leaned back in his chair, evaluating his choices. He wanted to let the official inquiry follow its path, but it was obvious now if he could slow things down, the department was doing everything it could. Waited any longer, the already precarious public confidence would vanish totally. James's voice is strong. "If they won't move, it's time to release the officer's name. I'm not waiting anymore." Joshua's eyes grew somewhat. "You're sure about that? You know what type of blowback James will get." James stood up. "The department is trying to defend him, therefore pacing the room. The people deserve to know who is accountable for what happened to me." "That's exactly why." Joshua nodded immediately. Locked in this mess, they believed they could hide behind process, but not anymore. "I'll arrange a press release using his phone. The media will be all over this." "Great," James said. "Let them be. I'm not going to allow Harlan or the union linger while this city waits for justice." In an hour, James was perched outside City Hall. The press gathered once more, reporters crammed in, closed microphones pushing. James stared out at the gathering, his face set with resolve as the air buzzed with expectation. "Good afternoon. Many of you are aware that we have been working on changes meant to solve problems inside our police force. Although even with the department's and the municipal council's pledges, the inquiry into the behavior of the activities taken Officer Greg Randall has been repeatedly stopped sufficiently. The audience calmed the evident stress I had waiting." James patiently waited for the police department to proceed with this inquiry. Unfortunately, the delays have gone on long enough today to name the cop engaged in the last week's incident. Greg Randall is the cop who illegally arrested and mistreated me." A murmur rippled across the assembly as reporters started jotting notes and taking pictures. "This is not only about," James stated, rising with conviction, "this is about responsibility. The residents of this city deserve openness, and they need to know. Officer Randall's actions were improper, hence who is accountable. The public has rights, and knowing his name will prevent the department from shielding him or postponing justice." Based on the questions the reporters asked came quick and furious, but James wasn't done yet. "I want to make another clear point," he said, his eyes fixed on the cameras. "This goes beyond one officer to include a system enabling cops like Randall to act. We are pressing for actual transformation without regard for far too long. I will not stop until this city witnesses the modifications it merits." As James left the podium, the buzz from the press caught Joshua caught up with. "Bold," Joshua murmured as they returned inside City Hall. James nodded his head quickly. "Already running ahead. That was the last action we had left. The union won't be able to hide behind the inquiry anymore. Harlan, they will have to pay for this." Within hours of the press conference, as the media inundated headlines about Officer Randall's name permeated every significant outlet in the neighborhood, and instantaneous demonstrations started to develop outside the police station, and calls for action got louder. But Joshua's most shocking outburst later that afternoon James's office, breathless. Harlan just dropped. James looked up startled. What? Chief Harlan resigned, Joshua? He simply said he was stepping down effective immediately. The pressure must have been too much. James reclined back in his chair, going over the news he received, not wanting to be the center of this anymore. Expecting opposition, not retreat. This was a triumph, even if it occurred sooner than intended. The department's in chaos right now. Joshua kept the unions running while the community demanded answers. James nodded gently. Good. Now, we move ahead even faster, avoiding stalling the resignation of the... James recognized that police chief was a pivotal point since Harlan left the agency, was susceptible, and though the path ahead was still lengthy, momentum for reform was at last in his advantage. It seemed like actual change was within reach. With Chief Harlan's resignation still rippling around the community, James wasted no time. Now more than ever, the police department was under examination, moving forward was under question, and the city needed. The next significant action would be the internal review board's ruling on Officer Greg Randall. But this... James stood in his office reading the most recent reports, not happy to be on the sidelines. Joshua arrived with an update on the review board meeting scheduled for next week. He handed James a folder they were using. Choosing Randall's future with the department. James barely glanced at the document. I wanted in on that meeting. Joshua blinked. Then you want to sit on the review board? They are not going to appreciate that the board's intended. James responded, his voice stern. To be internal, just the department and union representatives. That exactly is the problem. Saw how internal investigations proceed, dragging it out in discussion of the ramifications, and then slap the officer on the wrist. Not this time. I want to be in that room to witness how they defend keeping someone like Randall on the force. Joshua stopped you. You are the mayor and have the power to advocate for this, but you know they will object to the merger. They will regard you as oversteering. James nodded immediately. Let them push. Heading toward his desk to make the call. I will be in that room, and Randall's days in this. James had formally asked to sit in on the review board meeting, but the department overbe the next morning. The reaction. Almost instantaneous. The union president, as expected, went on the aggressive, calling James demand a breach of the department policies and an unparalleled political excess among certain high-ranking officials inside the... James didn't care. The public was on his side, and so were the city's. Department reflected the feeling. Community leaders felt more pressure than ever to change. James was sure of one thing, though. James hurried into the conference, realizing this was the day the review board meeting was scheduled. The board had already convened in a modest private area with a large table in the middle. About Greg sat police review board senior officials, a union representation, and a legal counsel, so ensuring their compliance. James could sense the tension in the air when Randall sat at the end of the table. His face was pale but rebellious. He took his. Captain Reynolds, the leader of the review board, cleared his throat and stated in a controlled tone, Major Trent, I know you have asked to see the events today. James moved his head toward Randall. I'm here since the people of this city find great betrayal of the confidence in the conduct of accountability Officer Randall put in him by the public. I want to make sure this board decides wisely. Reynolds seemed uncomfortable but mindful of the public interest in this issue. But as you are aware, these procedures usually handled internally. We are here to assess Officer Randall's behavior and decide whether disciplinary action up to and includes termination. James leaned forward, his words calm but strong. With all due respect, this case transcends standard internal affairs. Officer Randall's abuse of his power to just follow protocol attacked me and almost detained me without justification solely because of his prejudices. This goes beyond department policy. It's about the integrity of the whole force. Randall had stayed mute till now. At last spoke, his voice defensive. I did what I had to do. You were late at night, not responding to my inquiries. I was. James looked at Randall, his countenance sharp. Your training didn't advise you to overlook what I was saying. Your training advised against escalating the matter without cause. This isn't about method, it's about your presumptions. Randall shifted uneasily, his voice tight. I have dealt with plenty of circumstances whereby someone claims to be merely waiting for a ride and turns out to be a criminal. I contacted you, and Made the incorrect call, James shot back. You based on who I am, not what I was doing, that's the difference. Captain Reynolds looked between James and Randall, then spoke to the room. We would remain in silence for a time. Now hear remarks from Officer Randall and go over the internal investigation's results while the conference went on. The board examined the proof contradicting Randall's behavior that evening, including body camera footage and witness testimony. The case against him. James stayed mute for much of the procedures, but every time Randall tried, James felt his wrath surge at last. Following hours of Captain Reynolds turned to James. Mayor Trent, before we called off, is there anything else you would want to say? James stood, his eyes fixed on Randall. I have heard enough justifications from Officer Randall. Today's refusal to own responsibility for his conduct tells me everything I need to know. The people of this city deserve better. They also deserve a police force they can rely on to guard and serve everyone. Officer Randall's reputation would be tarnished if prejudice kept him on this force. He must be. Randall snarled, his voice low. Then you're making me seem to be a monster. I didn't wake up that day intending to arrest anyone I was working on, if that's what you believe your job is then. James answered sharply. You should never have worn that badge in the first place. Captain Reynolds nodded, surveilled around. An hour later, the board returned with their choice. Captain Reynolds spoke in the room the board decided upon. Plainly, his voice consistent. After looking into the facts and hearing all remarks, the board has decided that Officer Greg Randall's behavior violated department policy. His acts were unethical and improper officer behavior. Randall is being let go from the police department effective right away. James had a flood of relief. But he maintained a blank face as Randall clearly shook the former officer departed the room without making eye contact with anyone. Captain Reynolds turned to James and said, thanks for being here, Mayor Trent. We know this was a significant choice for the city. James nodded in calm, yet although this is only the beginning and the people of the city are observing, this was the correct choice. We must keep advocating for the changes meant to stop this from ever occurring. As James left the room, Joshua saw him in the corridor. He had a satisfied expression. Randall's gone. James nodded. It's a triumph, but still more has to be done to ensure the reforms pass. Joshua smiled. One battle at a time, Mike. Yet James turned back at the door of the review board, sensing the weight of the history today. Time perhaps, but we have many more battles ahead of us. As they left City Hall, James understood that while Randall was gone, the battle for true change had only just started. Still, this one was notable, even if deep. Though the road to transformation was long, James was eager to address core problems in the department. Set the standard. Disclaimer. This channel is in opposition to all forms of human rights violations, intolerance, bigotry, and discrimination. The narratives that are presented here are original works that were designed to encourage constructive dialogue, comprehension, and introspection. Respect for diversity and the preservation of human dignity are the guiding principles for the creation of all content.